I'd love to hand it over to my dear friend and colleague, Bronwyn Morgan. She is our moderator for this panel and the CEO of Zero Air. So, Bronwyn, over to you.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Dawn. So glad to be here with this great panel. So we're going to talk about a very interesting subject, and that is legal sea lanes for seafaring autonomous vehicles. How many of you guys have actually seen any of those yet? It is amazing what we're doing from a technology perspective. But with that, I would like to really have a chance for our amazing panel to introduce themselves quickly. If you would go first, please, Tom.
Yeah. Hi, Tom Reynolds. I'm a retired naval officer, started off as a surface warfare officer on big ships, and then actually was selected to go drive small boats in Singapore. Went to school in Singapore for a little bit. If anybody's been around the Straits of Malacca, you know that's a pretty crazy place. And then I went into the special operations community, have a few deployments into theater, into combat, and reflecting on it, you don't realize it at the time, but every single one of those deployments I did in theater involved unmanned systems in every domain. And so they're actually already there. They're already part of a system. And I was, I guess, very lucky to gain some experience with that. And then about 10 years ago, I retired and I joined a company called Hydroid, which was owned by Kongsberg. We make unmanned underwater vehicles. And then 3 years ago, we were acquired by HII, Huntington Ingalls Industry, now HII, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development there. Thanks.
My name is Kirk Foster. Like Tom, I'm a retired naval officer, but I was an attorney, a judge advocate. I served in a variety of assignments, including litigation, criminal justice, deployed twice on ships built by Huntington Ingalls Industries. Also deployed for a year in Iraq and a year in Pakistan because I'm a Navy lawyer, and why not send me to places like that? Retired in 2016, and about 4 years ago started working for HII Mission Technologies, which has 6 business units, including the one that Tom represents, unmanned systems. We also have a nuclear environmental cleanup division, a division called Fleet Sustainment, where we support Navy repair, education, training around the globe, and then 3 other technology-focused business units, C5ISR, cyber, electronic warfare and space, and live virtual constructive training. So think aviation training simulators, training ranges, things like that. I'm the director of compliance, so a lot of time I spent most of my time chasing guys in business development and capture, making sure they're not violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or UK Anti-Bribery Act, which our guys don't do. So it's really a pleasure and opportunity to speak to this group today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Reynolds, and I am an active duty attorney in the United States Navy, a judge advocate. And yay! And in September, I will have 17 years of service. Prior to coming into the Navy, I worked at a Big 5 consulting firm as well as an internet startup, went to law school, completed a judicial clerkship, and then came in. Maybe a year after coming into the Judge Advocate General's Corps, I was sent to Afghanistan and had a great experience there where I was exposed to operational legal issues for the first time. So instead of going into litigation, that's what I've pretty much exclusively done throughout the course of my time in the Navy. And it really boils down to risk management and ensuring decision makers have the space that they need to fully assess a situation, make that choice that they need to make in order to achieve mission success. I've been lucky enough to work with conventional and special forces, and I've lived all over the world. Join the Navy, see the world, right? But they don't tell you 90% of it is water, which is very beautiful. But it's sometimes not what you're expecting. But I'm very humble and grateful to be here in front of you all today. I've learned so much already, and I look forward to talking with you all.
Thanks. Sean Prybil. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Holland and Knight. My background is primarily in the maritime space as a former licensed shipmaster, spent 8 years at sea on the commercial side, former Coast Guard JAG as well. And then I worked overseas in Norway at a P&I club, for those who know what that is, essentially marine insurance, where we worked with autonomous vessels that were based in the UK and Norway. My current practice, I work with both surface and subsurface clients, helping them with the regulatory authorizations and compliance matters for their respective business cases. I'm also the chair of the Maritime Law Association Autonomous Ships Committee. We're the only legal committee in the U.S. that's designated to autonomous ship dialogue. Thanks.
Wow, just the bios alone, I think, have answered all the questions that we've got. So from air to sea, when we think about this, we're talking about autonomy, obviously not just in the sky, but also now underwater. And I was talking to someone, said, this is not really new. We've been in this domain for a long time. But now as we really start talking about the legalities of autonomous equipment in these spaces, we talk about rivers, we talk about seas, we talk about oceans. This is now becoming a reality for us. And we think about MASS, which are maritime autonomous surface ships, get used to that one, uncrewed underwater vehicles, UUVs, more acronyms for us, and then also remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. So the questions that we're going to answer today are around what are the rules that apply to these vehicles and what are the risks and security issues, something that we're all facing. So with that, let's kind of set the stage first from a legal perspective. Tom, who governs these waters? How do they govern them for both military and civilian operations? How do we think about that?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start off by saying I'm the only non-lawyer, up here. So you guys can please improve on my answer. But the International Maritime Organization has a thing called coal regs, the regulations for the prevention of collisions at sea, and it's been around since 1972. Prior to that, there were treaties which all governed common sense. So how do ships interact at sea, and what are the basic, rules out there for ship handling. So that is on the commercial side, what, we follow. We build ships to have the sensors, and you have the space for the lookouts and follow all those rules. And I'll say then also, and then the U.S. Coast Guard maintains the U.S. version of that. I'll also add though that if we were thinking about, defense operations, rules of engagement are incredibly important. And those are going to be dictated by what the combatant commander feels, needs to have happen. And sometimes they will not be in compliance with call regs. Combat operations sometimes mean, well, tanks don't stop at red lights, and so you can imagine that at sea, you just may have to make some tough choices. So when and I'm going to just say this from the standpoint of, designing and building and thinking about, future surface vessels, the discussion that I enjoyed quite a bit was what we just talked about, beforehand here with beyond visual line of sight, and about how that really, and weather, and how that really speaks to what goes on in the maritime domain. So let me just paint the picture of the sea is a tough environment. Under the sea, there are no communications. I mean, very little. And then also it's chaotic. You have rules of the road, but to tell you the truth, most places where the U.S. Navy at least operates, and other folks, the people that are on those fishing boats in the Straits of Taiwan or on the Dhows in the Arabian Gulf, really have not studied the international rules of the road. So when we are designing and building, our vessels, we definitely have to account for, all right, we need to be coal regs compliant. And how do we do that? How do we replicate the watch standards, and how do we ensure that we will follow the rules of the road? In addition to that, okay, how are we going to be adaptable to follow rules of engagement and have the vessel do some maneuvers or make some decisions that would be required for it to conduct its mission, which might not be, according to those rules of the road to coal regs. And then how do we handle a chaotic environment where the vessels that we're interacting with have no idea what the coal regs are, and they're going to turn left when they should turn right, and that happens often. And I'll say, again, the discussion about where we are with infrastructure. I mean, that digital infrastructure that was talked about before, how actually relevant that is for the maritime domain. Because again, without communications, those decisions need to be made, on site, on the platform itself. And then I guess we talked about those different acronyms. Maybe I'll just explain it. One way is that there's a scale of autonomy. You have uncrewed systems, which are really extensions of an operator. And that's true with a lot of what's going on with unmanned air vehicles, and why I think unmanned air vehicles are really leading the way with a lot of the policy. And then you get into, some autonomy that's aiding manned vessels. So think about some autopilot, or think about the technology you have on vessels. Then to fully autonomous, where now that decision is happening, and this is true with a lot of unmanned underwater vehicles because there's no communication with them. Those decisions need to be made by the vessel, themselves, and there's that sliding scale. What?
I appreciate all of your comments. Would you mind if I?
You want to take it? Please
A
do.
couple of points. And we're not related, by the way, despite the striking resemblance and sharing the last name. But I really appreciate how he set the stage for what rule sets are applicable when we're thinking about the maritime environment. I'd also like to point out that while in national airspace, aircraft are quite accustomed to deconflicting that airspace in the stack. That's something we also have to think about in the maritime environment, because there are those unmanned systems in the water column. So from the seabed, the water column, the surface, and the airspace, those types of considerations have to be taken into effect. And from a legal regime perspective, up to the 12 nautical mile line of the continental United States, as well as territory and possessions, we treat that water space exactly the same as we do the land. Full sovereign rights apply. So all of the regulations and statutory guidelines that we've been discussing so far today are applicable in that instance. You get to 12.1, and that's the high seas. So the U.S. does have an interest in our exclusive economic zone that continues on for another 200 miles. But from a navigational regime perspective, under international law, the legal obligation is due regard. And it's applicable from the airspace to the surface, to the water column, to the seabed. Coal rigs, as Tom mentioned, is really a manifestation at the tactical level of due regard. You can ask a lawyer, what does due regard mean? We're like, we don't know. We need to think about the facts and apply them to the circumstances, and it depends. You ask a watchstander on the bridge of a warship what due regard is, and they can recognize it and describe it in an instant. And that's the human connection here, that as we move from autonomy, how do we do that? What if the sensor is what we're relying on instead of an eyeball? That human brain, through culture, tradition, training, and that maritime tradition and history, is well tuned to making those due regard type of decisions. I'm not sure that our technology can do that. It's only as good as the algorithm can be. And I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here, Sean, in a second, and I'm sure you have plenty of things to say too. But I wanted to also mention that in your reading materials associated with this panel, you'll see the Department of Defense's autonomy instruction, and that human being in the loop piece, as well as the ethical considerations. I've been an ethics counselor for 16 and a half years now. And even though most of that work is within the standards of conduct type of business for federal employees, those ethical considerations are also something we're thinking about as it relates to autonomy, to interactions with these algorithms. And you'll see in that DoD instruction that there is an ethical obligation to ensure a lack of bias in these autonomous systems. So I just think that's a really fascinating connection too. And the Naval Warfare publication 1TAC14 Mike is an excellent resource because, as I think we all know, the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but we treat those manifestations of UNCLOS as they're a reflection of customary international law. By policy, we abide by them all the time. And that publication is tri-service. It's all the maritime services. So it's Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps. So if you're ever wondering, gosh, I wonder what DoD thinks is reflective of customary international law from UNCLOS, it's in that pub. And it's easily Googleable, and you can dip in and out of it to get that type of guidance.
Now, Tracy, before you hand that over to Sean, I want to come back here to Kirk first. Yeah, thank you. That's fine. I'm still here. And so, Kirk, can you go a little bit deeper into where she started and talking about these lines of demarcation and how, domestic, international, and based on these vehicles, are they vehicles? Are they, how do we classify this space?
No, and I'll do it very quickly. And I think that the three quick questions, or the questions that have to be addressed, is what's operating, how it's operating, and where is it operating? So very, very quickly, there's a baseline. So imagine the coast, straight coast, and the lowest point of the tide is the baseline. Anything landward of the baseline is internal waters, rivers, lakes, some cases bays, gulfs, things like that. The first 12 miles, that first band, as Tracy pointed out, is the territorial sea. That's considered sovereign territory. Baseline out 24 miles is called the contiguous zone. And I call that sovereignty-like, sovereignty light. A coastal state can enforce certain laws, fiscal laws, think smuggling, immigration, sanitary. You don't want ships just coming through and dumping garbage or medical waste that close to your coast. Then you go back to the baseline and go out 200 miles, and that is the exclusive economic zone. So think resources. That's where a coastal nation has the right to study, survey, explore, exploit resources. Fisheries, that's why the Coast Guard deploys around the world to our, the possessions in the Pacific, to watch some of the fisheries in the South Pacific and around the islands out there. Oil, gas. So that is all regulated, but it's still considered high seas. And then past the 200 nautical mile mark is the high seas. But what are you operating? Are you operating a warship? How are you operating it? Are you just passing through, or are you trying to do flight operations? Are you training your guns around? Are you launching small submersible vehicles to do intelligence gathering? So it depends what you're doing, how you're doing it, and where you're doing it. And that's where different rights and benefits and obligations will apply.
And Kirk, does it also apply to, deep submarine-based operations as well? Those
Absolutely.
lines of demarcation?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And as Tom explained, there's just different levels of autonomy that will trigger certain requirements as well. So.
Okay. Sean, could you talk to us about this from an international perspective?
Sure. So I think it's important also just to kind of bring it back to center for a second to ask, what are the co-regs? I mean, if we've touched on this, and I'll just expand just a little bit, but also why does it matter to you? So if you're developing these technologies, whether it's on the surface or if it's on the subsurface, the co-regs apply to all vessels. So that's the most important, I think, consideration here is if you are designing, building, operating vessels, then you are obligated to comply with the full range, I think it's 41 rules, of the co-regs. And what's complicated about it is that the co-regs were developed with humans in mind. So there's no concept of uncrewed operations under the co-regs, but that applies to vessels. So if you have a vessel, you need to go through that full list of these rules and understand how your technology is going to meet these very specific rules. What makes it complicated is that there's human concepts in there like sight and hearing. So how does a computer meet these requirements of hearing? Now, there's arguments that say, well, that can be done by sensors or something. But there are strict interpretations of the co-regs that say that wasn't contemplated at this international convention, and we can't just interpret it that way. Other rules require good seamanship. That's a human element. So how does your computer system, your machine learning, the AI, how does that evidence good seamanship? These are complex issues that you should be working through. Why does it matter? Because you as the owner or the operator, the contractor, whatever it may be, you may have legal obligations for compliance. And if you're out of compliance, if there's an accident somehow, then that would flow back to you at the product development stage, perhaps, wherever it may be, where the litigation would then look at, well, how did you meet these co-regs requirements? So very challenging. I think that what also makes it important to understand is that the co-regs were developed at the international level with the IMO, as we've heard about. That is then domesticated now into U.S. law. So you have statute and regulatory requirements as well under U.S. law. And then that applies to all U.S. vessels, wherever located. Last point I'll make on it is that it applies to vessels that are on the water. So for submersibles, yes, we've heard about various jurisdictional zones that are governed by various international instruments, but it's when it's on the water. So when it surfaces, now you have a subsurface vessel that now comes to the surface. Now that has to comply with the various rules.
Wow, that's very interesting. Let's take this a little bit further and better understand policies and policy priorities and how they are adjusting and adapting to keep up with these new technologies in this space. Sean?
So a very timely meeting. Last Thursday morning, we had our Maritime Law Association meeting in New York City, heard from the legal director at the IMO looking at the international level. The main takeaway there is that there's an international movement to examine all of these issues. So there's no shortage of work being done. The point at the international level is to try to develop some type of international order. So in about 2024, we should be expecting a voluntary mass code that's coming down, that then 2028, if all goes well, would be mandatory. At the U.S. level, the primary U.S. entity involved with this is the U.S. Coast Guard, but we also have other agencies like NOAA and the U.S. Navy. So at the federal, federal level, they're working through, as Tracy mentioned, through the Naval's Commander's Handbook, developing that policy, but that's not aligned right now. So you could be a commercial operator that's going to the Coast Guard having one conversation, but you're on the Navy side as a contractor perhaps, and you're having that different conversation where priorities are just not aligned. That creates risk. That's why I think it's really important to come to have a conversation with legal counsel to understand what's my real risk here, what do my contracts say, and what's happening on the U.S. policy side. That's in development right now, being driven by commercial markets with a real struggle from the U.S. Coast Guard to have the expertise to understand how this is all moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Tracy, were you about to say something? I didn't want to let you about to add something.
I really appreciate being up here with all of these different colleagues to talk about the different facets of these particular issues, because in the absence of a bright line demarcation in law, interpreting the policy is always a challenge. And one of my primary concerns is preserving the commander's decision space. And an issue that may develop over time, and as we've heard other panelists talking about, the technology develops at a pace different than the policy does. And there's a constant conversation as to whether we need new law or if we just need to apply through policy the law that we have in a dynamic or unique way. And we see that with weather in the Navy, just like the previous panel discussed, the desire for data, but not so much data that it restricts decision space because you can't get through it all. And those policy applications are always waiverable as well. So I would like to posit that to you all as practitioners and as industry specialists. If you're willing to go up high enough, you can get a waiver for anything. You just have to have a good reason. And the buy-in of all of those different levels of relationship and hierarchy to have a good request to have a waiver to that policy that's in place. Because we're not talking about law now. We've talked about the use of force and rules of engagement. That is not law. That is a personification of a commander's risk tolerance in order to complete a particular mission. And in those instances, you can kind of talk through with counsel the type of risk that you're exposed to, as Sean pointed out, and the ways in which you can mitigate that risk in policy, determine what is law, and then shape the policy in a way that helps you meet whatever your mission is, whether it's industry or military specific.
Thank you. And Kirk, and Tom, from a private sector perspective, what's your reaction to that? How are you feeling about, where we stand from a policy perspective on this side of the fence?
Well, I'd say two things. One, we need to be aligned. Our customer is usually the U.S. government, and we need to design and build what our customer will need. We'll be responsive to those requirements. And I'd say time is on our side, I think, when it comes to the commercial side about technology. There's a business case. When it comes to commercial vessels, you were talking about a business case, we're talking about dollars, and there will be maybe some decision points being made at the pace of business. As my colleagues up here have experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan, sometimes we don't have control of that timeline. And so as far as what we're designing and building, we recognize that we're probably ahead of the Coast Guard with what our capabilities are and what we're building. We are finding that we're successful with negotiating with Coast Guard districts as far as getting the waiver that Tracy talked about. But ultimately, we're designing and building vessels that can operate safely and do their best to follow coal regs as far as the policies go, but they're also going to be leading more on the side of risk tolerance, because the enemy will control that timeline. Sometimes we won't have that luxury of time there. So I think on the commercial side, time is not the driver. The combatant commanders downrange might be forced into a decision and guided by the counsel on what they will have to choose between a bad and a worse decision. And so I'd say we certainly respect policy, but we needed to provide a capability to the government, to the U.S. Navy, that gives them options to do something different than current policy, if they choose to.
If I may, yeah, it's going to be the mission that's going to drive it. And as I think decisions, and it is heartening to hear how far along the IMO is as far as the coal regs and change, because to borrow a phrase from I guess it was the Crown of Thorns, or that TV show. Now winter is coming, but Game of Thrones. Thank you. Thank you. Took me a while. It took me a while. My nieces and nephews will torment me. But instead of winter is coming, technology is coming. And it's here.
Yeah.
It's here. You're exactly right. And the regulators better catch up. And they're running in time, maybe. But it's going to be the mission on the military side, where command is going to say, yeah, I understand I should have control of that submersible vehicle, but I need that submersible vehicle that's uncrewed to get into a certain place, to get intelligence that's going to make the difference on a mission. And so that's the driver, I think. From an attorney's perspective, representing a company, I'm worried about the product's liability. I'm worried about our guys testing products that might go askew and puncture a hole in the 25-foot fiberglass pleasure boat. And then we're checking, well, what's the contract say? Who's got liability? Is there indemnification? I'm calling our risk management guys at headquarters saying, hey, do we have insurance for this? But we do.
Right.
We managed U.S. Air Force's drone program in Eastern Europe for a while. And the FAR contracts talk about liability. They talk about indemnification, and you get insurance for just about anything.
That's true.
So you got to pay for it, right? So, yeah, to your earlier point, Tracy, do we really need to develop new laws and new regs and policies, or can we just look to something that's existing? I'm going to pass it over.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to some thoughts I have on that. So we've heard some comments about waiving policy. And I want to be clear about something, is that right now under U.S. statute, that the U.S. Coast Guard's view is you cannot waive law. So that's a big distinction here. So the U.S. Coast Guard's view is the statutes require that a human be on board, and that cannot be waived unless Congress says that it can. And that's an important consideration, especially on the commercial side, but also because US law, that involves COREGs. So if your vessels that are operating, COREGs cannot be waived either. So now that is a position that the US Coast Guard has taken at that federal level. That conversation's happening because there are divergent priorities in terms of what the Coast Guard is doing as a regulator, and they're taking a very strict interpretation of this. So how you can get a waiver from statute and from regulation is a very different idea than a waiver from policy. So I just want to make that clear that those are two different lanes. And then in the compliance side as well, I know we've talked on a few different issues, but COREGs is also from the technology side. This is something that is navigation and collision avoidance technology. And if you're exporting that technology, you should be thinking about export controls. And if you're not, that's data, that's not just the physical components, the units, that is data. You need to understand where that technology falls under ITAR and other export controls.
Sean, this is great. And we could talk all day long, but what I want to do, and that was exactly where I'm going next, I'd like to hear some predictions from each of you, very short, very quickly. And the first one is about data, cybersecurity. Data safety. We're talking about if equipment that is autonomous, it could somebody could easily capture it. It's gone off. You've got a lot of goodies from us that we don't want out there. So could someone talk to that first, and then I'd like to hear your predictions?
One comment I'd like to make, just based on everything that I've heard so far today, is the commonality across the panels. I think what Bronwyn has identified is the intersectionality and overlap of the issues that we face. What she is speaking about in particular with AI and these advancements in technology is whether we want to deal with it or not, we have to. And we have to be cognizant of how far of a reach across agency, government, that these impacts will arise. We talk about the interagency being a bag of octopuses because there's not really a hierarchical structure. You just have to know where to go and who to talk to. We've heard lobbyists speaking about how they're trying to meet with federal and local governments in order to ensure deconfliction and understanding of the disparate legal regimes under which you have to operate in order to have commercial advancements. That is not going to go away. And from my prediction, this that we're dealing with now is simple compared to what is coming. You cannot have UAS systems without outer space. You can't have information operations without outer space. You can't have AI without information operations. You can see how interconnected all of this is. And whether you're talking about the FCC, the FAA, the Department of Defense, we're not even talking about local governments at this point. Being witting and aware of this intersectionality, as we've heard described across all of the panels, is vital. And that's why you need a lawyer, unfortunately. My decision makers are always like, wow, Tracy, this can't possibly be, or they call me judge. They'll say, Judge, this cannot possibly be right. And I'm like, listen, you want me to route a waiver to Congress? I'll do it. You want me to write something to send to the Secretary of Defense to get you permission to do this thing you want to do? Fine. And guess what? I've done that before. And if you do the legwork and the research, it took 18 months for one of those things, but it's possible. That was probably longer than you wanted.
No, that's great. Other predictions, and then we're going to get to questions in a minute and comments, predictions.
Right.
Yeah.
So one prediction is that the path to autonomy lies in aiding manned vessels. That I don't know that we're going to leap as quickly from manned and swing and hit the home run and get to unmanned that quickly on vessels where we don't have to, especially if we're looking at larger vessels. If you're out there and you have some technology that, because first of all, bridge crews aren't perfect already. Ships do have collisions at sea, and autonomy isn't perfect, but it needs to learn. It lacks wisdom right now. So better sensors, autonomy, aiding a manned vessel will give you right away, a safer platform. At the same time as you're going to train that AI to go from artificial intelligence to artificial wisdom, and I think that's my hope is that's more what I think the Navy and other folks might realize in the next few years before we leap right to a fully unmanned surface vessel, especially something that's large.
Yeah, that seems to be the case for everything. It's just not instant. There's a lot in the middle around safety. Kirk, please.
No, I like that idea. More of a mothership with a herd of, AI-driven vehicles going out and doing their mission. But consistent with DoD policy, the commander is on that mothership, managing that force. I think with that, that kind of a crawl, walk, run approach to unmanned or uncrewed submersible, uncrewed surface vehicles, the law and the regulation can develop. Because, in preparation for this panel, reading some of the background materials, there are some academicians who are of, well, you can't change the coal regs. They were never imagined to be without human beings. Well, please, life is changing. Technology is here. You need to get the regs and the policies and the procedures in place. But it does sound, Sean, that we're moving in that right direction, if I may.
Very good points. And I think as far as predictions along that line is, yes, in my view, there's two camps. One is a very strict interpretation of the coal regs that it just can't happen whatsoever. And then a more pragmatic view. So I kind of sit in that camp. And part of what I'm seeing is this idea that it's impossible until it isn't. And so the most recent example of this, so where the market's going, I think wherever the business case develops, that's where it's going to go. So if you're a naval contractor, there's a huge national security interest in developing this technology. That business case, that's going to move forward. On the commercial side, we're seeing this in the offshore wind development. We're seeing this in the offshore space side quite a bit. And an important caveat with that is, I mentioned earlier that statutes can't be waived unless Congress says that they can. And that's what they've done in this National Defense Authorization Act in December, where they are allowing for 5 years under a pilot program that the Coast Guard can waive navigation and manning laws to support offshore at-sea launch and reentry operations for commercial space only. So predictions, I think we're going to see more in the commercial space side, more ideas of how to use different types of vessels, more data collection. This is a huge part of what NOAA does. They're very eager to see more of this technology. But ultimately, yes, we're going to have to see that needle move from the regulator to be more pragmatic to say, so how do we get these waivers? How do we interpret this in a more pragmatic way?
Well, let's take that now. Thank you all so much for that. Questions from the audience. Where do we have questions? All right. Let's see. This lady here. So is the intent to actually carry people, although there may not be any command and control on the aircraft, on the vehicle?
Right.
Who wants to take that?
Yes, and that's part of the concepts that are developing. So that's part of the terminology. So optionally manned, uncrewed, whatever it may be. Some concepts will keep people on board, maybe like an engineering crew, maybe the Marines are looking at this from transportation of Marines, but no one on the bridge perhaps. And the other part of this on the how would that be done, prediction-wise also related to that is maybe that would be a remote control operation where a human will likely always be somewhere in that loop, and that would probably mitigate some of the concern and risk with that type of carriage. But yes, those concepts, I'm not sure about the nursing space, but anyone on the
at this moment, there are health agreements, particularly with NATO and other partner nations, specifically related to the health needs and health care of individuals that are embarked upon Navy vessels. And it appears, just to forecast a little bit, again, not speaking with the Navy's voice here, just my own predictions, I think that it will continue to trend in that direction, where anytime human life is in question, particularly stability of care, that there will be agreements, whether they're multilateral, bilateral, to articulate very clearly exactly what level of care should be provided.
Okay.
And if I may, just as an interesting question, because, at sea, there's a duty to render assistance. And if a ship is sinking or, a yacht is sinking, hey, the nearest ships, if you have a duty to go there and render assistance. But what if it's an autonomous ship?
That's
And
interesting.
will that ship have the ability to, one, give a position, of course, but also distribute life rafts? Because there's somebody managing, a control spot somewhere that could do that. So that's all being discussed. And I think and then for warships to chase down bad actors, or Coast Guard ships to chase down drug runners or things like that.
Great. But a gentleman, and I'll come to this, a gentleman back there, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
Yes, Sean, you spoke about some potential IMO updates. I'm just curious if you expect that to bring about additional regulations, subsurface.
Additional IMO subsurface regulations. Okay.
It has not come up because most of the international instruments that relate to it are outside the IMO. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is probably the most applicable to the subsurface operations, but that's not under the IMO's rubric. So they are deferring on that. There are a number of countries that want to have more of that discussion, but I don't see personally, there's no reports that I'm getting that is a priority right now.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Yeah, I'm president of AUVSI and Huntington chapter down in the Gulf Coast, and we have a large maritime group down there. And I can tell you right now, all our shipyards are already building autonomy into all our ships down there. Everything from pirates coming aboard, there's a place in the bridge where the captain can turn the key, and our folks all the way back to the satellite can run the ship. And we push coal wrecks as far as we can with reducing the manpower. We used to have the best in the Gulf 25. We're now down to around 14, but we're now at an impasse with showing the limited technology to take over some of it. So my question really is about is there any language to go on the next step beyond the space and to get into the actual maritime transportation section, especially oil and gas, which has a lot of technology out there to monitor our rigs.
All right, that'll be our last question, but who wants
Yeah,
to?
short answer is just looked at the newest Coast Guard Authorization Act. I didn't see any. There is a new, perhaps of relevance here. There's a proposal for an advisory committee, so a new FACA for autonomous systems. And that is only in draft language, so that hasn't been passed into law. But the short answer is I haven't seen anything yet, but it's conversations I had with the maritime administrator in Norfolk about 2 weeks ago with her and U.S. Coast Guard's legal team in New York as well to see, how are we going to move forward with this? Do we have to create new, subsections of every authorization act for every single? Yeah, we can talk offline about that also, but go ahead.
Tom?
Hey, Mike Smitsky, please stand up. All right. So Mike runs the AUVSI Maritime Committee. If other folks, don't know him, he works with the U.S. Coast Guard often, NOAA often, and he also works on getting language into NDAA. So, sorry, it sounds like you already know him, Mike, real well. So if folks don't, and they're interested in being involved in our Maritime Committee and having your voice heard, along with about 40 other companies, Mike? Where are we, 40? Please see Mike, and he can help make sure your voice is heard. Thanks.
Mike has all the answers. We love that. Thank you so much. Thank you to this fabulous panel. One thing that we know, if you're planning this or if you're working on this, if you have questions, talk to your maritime legal counsel immediately. Thank you. Okay. Okay. You know what? We got time for one more question. One more. Okay. We got two real quick. We can make them quick. This gentleman and that gentleman.
You mentioned the language Rule 5 not being able to be interpreted
Just a little bit more specifics on that, Alan, so.
Well, you said, sight and sound.
Right,
And that's, of course, that's only part of the rule, part of the flag.
Right, right.
All systems, just not just sight and sound. But specifically, are you aware of any case where a court has said, Rule 5, sight and sound can't be applied, doesn't apply to maritime?
I looked at this when I prepared the study committee reports for the National Academies of Sciences in 2020 on leveraging unmanned systems for Coast Guard missions. I'd have to go back and look. It's not something that we had prepared for here in terms of case law, given the audience here. So I'd have to, we can take it offline and we can talk later, but it's not something I looked at for this particular panel.
But Rule 5 is something that obviously we've got a lot of questions on, so.
Yeah, and it's, my point on that, by the way, was not Sean's view as far as whether it applies or not, or whatever case law. My view is these are the conversations that are being had by the U.S. Coast Guard and at the IMO, and it's essentially unresolved. And I just wanted to say that it's something that when you're developing your technology, that you should be thinking, how is your system going to meet that? Because the question's going to come up. So that was it, yeah. But
Okay, thank you. Gentleman here.
I had a very quick question. I work a lot in Europe, and they have designated test areas in Trondheim, Finland has one, the Port of Rotterdam has one. I wondered if you could talk about whether you thought it might be beneficial for some areas in the United States to be designated for unmanned vessels pilots.
Testing in U.S. waters?
So, yes, absolutely. The fun thing is that the U.S. actually works in those areas and coordinates with the government of Norway and the Norwegian military. And in a lot of ways, maybe our government shouldn't try to do it all. Maybe there are some things that are good for our partners to do. And certainly in shipping in Europe is very different than all the transatlantic shipping that we need to worry about. We definitely follow some businesses in Europe that their needs are to really cross one fjord to another, or just go from point A to point B, where remote control of the vessel is realistic. The trans-ocean, maritime environment is a different, is really almost not unique to the United States, but it's a big deal to us. Whereas in Europe, there's a lot of inter-European close to shore transit. Over.
Sean?
just very important that the U.S. Coast Guard has promulgated guidance on testing. So they took some of those testing area ideas from Norway, from Finland, and primarily from the IMO. So there was a policy letter, reach out to me afterwards if you want me to send it to you. That is that. And then also for those in the Gulf Coast, University of Southern Mississippi, I can connect you with them also. They're doing a lot of testing down there. Yeah.
Wonderful. This time, that's it. Thank you so much to this panel. Thank you.